Ladies and gentlemen, young men and young women, welcome to the Nixon Library for yet another Nixon Legacy Forum. Before we started, I'd like to cover a few things that are coming up that I hope you'd be interested in. One of them, of course, is our 20th anniversary reunion, which is July 16th, 17th, and 18th. Marking 20 years since we opened the library in Birthplace in 1990. We have a series of great events, public events throughout the week, and we hope you would go to nixonfoundation.org, that's nixonfoundation.org, and learn about what's available and how you can participate. I think you'll enjoy every minute of everything we're going to do during that exciting week. Also, I'd like to tell you that because of requests from parents and youngsters alike, we are repeating what was a very successful series last summer called Meet the Presidents, where we have morning programs every week during the summer to educate and give your kids a fun experience hearing from and learning about the presidents of the United States, from George Washington through Richard Nixon. Now, we don't do them all, of course, but we do 6 of them, and we include in that one on Pat Nixon as First Lady. Now, just so there's no misunderstanding, these are not the real presidents. No, they're not. However, with with President Nixon, it's Ed Nixon's younger brother, who is a look-alike, so it's pretty close to the real thing. On June 1, at 7 o'clock, we have Dick Morris returning for his 8th blockbuster bestseller, 2010 Take Back America. It'll be in our East Room, and if you'd like to come, if you would go online to nixonfoundation.org, tickets are still available. That's June 1. We decided, as part of our 20th anniversary, that the most important thing we could do is to go in depth to the Nixon legacy, the innovations, the initiatives that President Nixon did that shows there's a lot more than Watergate to his many years as president. And during that time, we have scheduled, and for the next almost 2 years, monthly programs that we call the Nixon Legacy Forum. We started it on January 8th in our East Room, and these are jointly sponsored by us as the Richard Nixon Foundation and the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, which is the National Archives part of this institution, and the foundation, which is private and supports the work in education and cultural activities that associate with Richard Nixon's many years in public service. The first one was January 8th on domestic affairs. The second one was February 15th. It was entitled The Effective Use of the President's Time, and we brought together the several staff members who were the immediate assistants to President Nixon in managing his time, in scheduling his time, in moving him both here and throughout the world. And these people, who were very young at the time, came back for 2 hours of how it was done, because the Nixon Oval Office to this day is still considered a model of effective and efficient use of the president's time. The next one was April 22nd, which was Earth Day, and that dealt with a focus on the environment, and that too was here. That's followed by today, of course, on the Mysteries of Watergate, and this will be followed on June 2nd in Washington at George Washington University, where they are jointly hosting with us a program called RN and the Origins of Welfare Reform, and that's at 1:30 at George Washington University. That will be followed by the peaceful desegregation of Southern schools on September 23rd here. These are great opportunities to hear and learn about the Nixon legacy. They're usually very well attended, and we've been fortunate in having C-SPAN cover many of them as they are today. I'd like to welcome the AP students from Brea High School. I want to hear from you. The kids from Brea, would you give me a welcome? As part of the 20th anniversary, we realized that probably the most important thing we could do would be to recognize that there's a conspicuous shift in public opinion and even among former critics about President Nixon's record, that they're realizing that indeed there's a lot more than Watergate, that his imaginative and creative policies are felt throughout our government and throughout the world today. So we have organized these monthly programs, and our new president, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, spent years with President Nixon in the White House, was later appointed director of the National Park Service, spent years with President Bush, President Reagan, and President Nixon in his later years after leaving the White House, and knows as well as anybody I can name the Nixon legacy. So we drafted him to come here and be president of the Nixon Foundation. That was done by our chairman, Chris Elfman, who I'd like to acknowledge. Where is Chris? Where is he? Chris Elfman, who headed the search. So it's my pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce the president of the Nixon Foundation, my good friend, Ron Walker.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the President Richard Nixon Presidential Foundation. I see a lot of new faces and I see a lot of old friends. Welcome. Get my glasses out of here. Geoff's had an extraordinary career, and I'm going to share some of it with you, who is our presenter today. Geoff Shepard holds degrees from Whittier College and Harvard Law School, of which he attended both on scholarships. Upon graduation, he spent 5 years with President Nixon's White House staff. First, as a White House fellow. Secondly, as a member of the Domestic Counsel staff, which ultimately he became Associate Director of General Government Divisions. Geoff making his third appearance here at the library, the first being in 2008, when he came to discuss his recently published book on Watergate. The second, as Sandy just mentioned, was his moderating the panel in January of this year of the Nixon Legacy series on the founding of the Domestic Counsel, which was modeled after the National Security Council. A very interesting panel, and it was well attended, and I wish those that didn't have a chance to see it could have. Third is today. To launch his perspective, his Watergate panel will address the 5 Watergate conspiracies. I should add, for the last 3 decades, Geoff has arranged and hosted an annual event in Washington known as the White House Policy Group. It was the planning staff of both Richard Nixon and the President Ford's staff, and it's been a great event for us to get together once a year, and we thank Geoff for that. What you should know for today's presentation is that Geoff was the functionary of Fred Bazar, the principal deputy during Watergate defense effort. In that capacity, he transcribed the White House tapes, and I think some of us feel that he was really the expletive deleter, ran the document room housing all the sensitive files, and briefed members of the senior staff on going on development. Thus, he not only lived Watergate and its scandal from the inside for almost 40 years, he also spent 5 years at the National Archives researching his 1980 book about Watergate. It's here in the library. We have it in the bookstore, and Geoff will be available afterwards if anyone would like to purchase one. With that, please join me in our presenter today, Mr. Geoff Shepard.
Thank you, my friend. Good afternoon and welcome to what I hope will be an interesting presentation. The focus is the mysteries of Watergate, and we're going to spend almost 2 hours talking about and reviewing why, after 37 years, there are still open questions about what happened in the greatest political scandal in our nation's history. Tim Naftali, who's director of the Nixon Library here, has said that conspiracy buffs connect dots that shouldn't necessarily be connected, and they ignore more substantial dots that should. Be that as it may, they call our attention to disturbing facts, inconsistencies in stories we've been told. Now, as Ron indicated, I'm a student of Watergate. I was on the White House staff for 5 years. I knew and worked with everybody that was involved. I was on John Ehrlichman's staff. My immediate superior was Bud Krogh, who was the head plumber. Gordon Liddy was on the domestic counsel with me. Chuck Colson's office was across the hall. John Dean's office was down the hall. My public policy responsibilities on the domestic counsel centered on the Department of Justice. So I knew all of the management, all of the leadership of the Department of Justice. These were my friends and my colleagues. Then, as Watergate grew and the scandal blew up, I became Fred Bizart's principal deputy, and I worked on the Watergate defense. It ended badly, as you may recall. I pondered why and how people I knew and worked with could have done the things they were accused of doing. In 2002, I decided to write my version of what I thought had happened. And I discovered at National Archives all of the records of the Special Prosecutor's Office had been maintained. They were government employees. Now, they weren't available for public review. You had to file Freedom of Information Act requests to get to them. And you had to ask for most stuff by name. They were classified and housed with the papers on the Kennedy assassination and the Ken Starr papers on the investigation and impeachment of President Clinton. So it was kind of like a closed stack system. You could look through the card catalog, but you couldn't wander amongst the files. And I spent 5 years pursuing and freeing up with FOIA requests hundreds of pages of documents that hadn't been public before. And I think a lot of what I found was in my book that I put out in 2008, but I've continued my research, and some of that we're going to talk about today. So the structure of today is the first segment reviewing what I call 5 Watergate conspiracies, and then we'll take some Q&A on those conspiracies, and then we'll spend the second segment focusing on John Dean, whom I think holds the key to understanding Watergate. First, we're going to start with a review of what happened. Some people weren't alive when Watergate happened. You only know it from stories of others. Some of the slides, I warn you, are slightly complicated because it's a complicated story. So I apologize in advance as we go through it. I'm going to try to help us remind ourselves of the essence of the scandal and then go into the conspiracies. The word Watergate comes from the name of a hotel office complex that was prominent in Washington, D.C. And uniquely, the Democratic National Committee had rented space in the Watergate office building on the 6th floor. Similarly, across the street in what was then the Howard Johnson Hotel, there was a monitoring room set up to monitor what were supposed to be wiretaps put into telephones in the Democratic National Committee. The break-in that we all remember is dated June 17th, 37, almost 38 years ago, because that's when the arrests occurred. Now, it will develop there was a previous break-in, but they were arrested on June 17th, so we think of that as the beginning of Watergate. It is generally conceded that President Nixon and Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman didn't have any idea about the break-in in advance, that it was a rogue operation. But what got them was the attempt to cover up the crime and the people that were involved and did know about the break-in in advance. And we have come up with one of these phrases that enters our vocabulary that you're not allowed to forget. It's not the crime, it's the cover-up. And the other is the question asked by Senator Howard Baker, the minority member of the Ervin Committee. And he kept asking during the Ervin hearings, isn't the real question, what did the president know? And when did he know it? Third, to remind ourselves for purposes of today, there are 6 principal figures we're going to be talking about. The bottom row are the folks who actually ran the operation. And we start with G. Gordon Liddy. Gordon Liddy engineered, designed, executed the Watergate break-in. John Dean, White House counsel, engineered, orchestrated the cover-up. He describes his role as being chief desk officer of the cover-up. Jeb Magruder had a role in both, so we have him in between. Real crimes, real criminals should have been punished, but not big fish. The big fish are up here on top. John Mitchell, Attorney General of the United States, the head of the committee to re-elect the president. Bob Haldeman, the president's chief of staff. John Ehrlichman, formerly counsel to the president, now assistant to the president for domestic affairs. Big fish. If we could get to them, we could get to President Nixon. And the question that remains today is whether the operating people down here, particularly in the cover-up, were under the direction and control of the big fish, or whether the big fish became scapegoats in a political attempt or a different conspiracy to destroy the Nixon presidency. The answer in conventional wisdom is very clear. They were all convicted. But that doesn't stop the inquiry, and that doesn't stop these books from being written that raise these troublesome questions. So we're going to spend the rest of the day talking about the troublesome questions and why Watergate remains in the news. It's been 37 years since the break-in, but the scandal won't go away. If you Google Watergate, you get 4 million hits. 2 years ago, 2008, there were 5 new Watergate books published, one of which was mine. And the Frost-Nixon movie was released, which reminded everybody of the president's interviews with David Frost after he had resigned as president. Last year, there were 3 major events, at least. The New York Times had a front-page story on the accuracy of the White House tapes, the transcripts. They're very poor quality, so you tend to hear what you want to hear. But there are bubbles today, a huge controversy over the accuracy of those transcripts. And this was a front-page article in February. In July, it became public that there was an effort to reconstruct Bob Haldeman's notes from what's known as the 18.5-minute gap. The presidential tape recording of that meeting is irretrievably lost. But Bob Haldeman took notes, and this particular theory says there's a page missing, because if you look at the page below it, there's indentations. And if you electronically review it, maybe you can recreate the supposed second page of notes that's missing, and we could learn something. That's an open question. That's ongoing. Third thing that happened is in September, shortly after Senator Ted Kennedy died, Chris Matthews, who's a rather prominent spokesperson, circulated an article on the internet that said it's little known, but Senator Kennedy is the one who orchestrated Nixon's demise. And that, of course, it kind of echoed my theory, so I like the article and I refer to it. But what we're not going to do is we're not going to try to undermine or disown the actual crimes of Watergate. We're going to talk about whether they were properly laid at the feet of the senior people. And we're going to do that by reviewing 5 Watergate conspiracies. The first one I titled Conventional Wisdom because they were convicted of a conspiracy to obstruct justice. So that's really the first conspiracy, but that's conventional wisdom. And then we have the blame game. There's a book out that says, no, it was the CIA that really enhanced the scandal to bring down the president. Another book a little bit later said, no, it was the conservatives in the military that didn't support what was going on and needed the president to come down. There's a rather obscure theory that says, no, it was the Rockefeller attempt to take over international finance, and that has an aspect of Watergate. And then there's what we call the Camelot conspiracy, which is the skillful exploitation of this scandal to line the way for Kennedy Democrats to take power in the 1976 election, to get back into power. Let's go through these one at a time. First, conventional wisdom, and we're just reminding you of the dates. The break-in date is June 17th, 1972, but there was an earlier break-in in May 28th. Even today, the reason for the break-ins is hugely controversial among students of Watergate. The CRP officials and the Cubans, 5 were caught red-handed in the building, 2 more were arrested afterwards. They were indicted on September 15th. The feeling was they hadn't gotten everybody because it didn't go high enough. The convictions occurred on January 30th, 1973, and everybody had pled guilty or was convicted of all counts by that time. The judge, Judge John Sirica, at the conclusion of the trial said, we haven't learned the truth. We really need help in further investigation. Amazingly, his request was answered within a week, and the Irvin Committee, the Senate Select Committee on the 1972 presidential election, was created. It didn't get geared up till the summer, but it's created in February of 1973. And then there are at least 4 hugely significant dates which kind of clock the demise of the Nixon presidency. The cover-up collapsed about 2 months after the convictions because the sentencing was due 2 months afterwards. And so the individuals who had been convicted were looking at substantial prison time. Now, there's a memo written on September 15th by the federal prosecutors that says, we aren't sure we got everybody, but what we're going to do is convict the folks we have and then see if they change their stories. So in a very real sense, the career prosecutors caused the cover-up to collapse. But it's also generally conceded it's the letter by James McCord, who had been convicted, letter to Judge Sirica that says there's been perjury, there's been a cover-up, you really don't know the truth. People who had been orchestrating the cover-up figured out rather early on that they were in real trouble. They sought deals with the career prosecutors. Watergate really blew up. There was turnover, and then there was a special prosecutor appointed in May of 1925. May 25th, 1973. The investigations and the leaks and the Irvin Committee effort destroyed the Nixon presidency. He resigned, as he should have resigned in August. He had lost the capacity to govern. Very, very clear he had been ruined. He might have fought on, but the party officials came and said, if you stay, we're going to get wiped out in November. You may want to fight, but you have to go. for the good of the party. We have to have turnover here. So the only resignation in United States history occurs on August 9th, but that didn't finish things. That top row of people were convicted in the cover-up trial on January 1st, 1975. So that for those of you who may have lived through it, that will remind you of kind of an 18-month period from the president's reelection until his resignation and the scandal reached maturity. Well, the first book came out in 1984. It was done by Jim Hogan, and it was entitled Secret Agenda, Watergate, Deep Throat, and the CIA, and I have Hogan's book right here. It said, in essence, it was the CIA that exploited this, and it is extraordinarily well researched. I read it again on the airplane on the way out. Almost every theory, every conspiracy theory, can be traced back to Hogan's seminal work. And he was really keen off of the minority group of the Irvin Committee who couldn't seem to get traction during the hearings and had all these loose ends. But 10 years later, Hogan had access to more than they did. And he starts with this very inconvenient fact. There were no taps found on the Democratic National Committee telephones. They were swept the day before the June 17th break-in by the DNC. They were swept by the telephone company, Chesapeake and Pacific Telephone, afterwards, and swept twice by the FBI. There were no wiretaps. Now, they found 4 wiretaps in the burglars' briefcases, and for the longest time, the prosecution thought the break-in was an attempt to install the wiretaps in the first place. And they really thought that the effort was to gather derogatory information on Larry O'Brien, who headed the DNC, in order to blackmail him. That was the theory of the prosecution. It had nothing to do with the Republicans. They really thought it was a rogue event. But then it developed that there had been in this earlier break-in, and there were transcripts prepared. The other points that Jim Hogan makes that are contradictions, everybody involved in Watergate, the actual operations, except Gordon Liddy, who thought he was heading it, had CIA connections. Howard Hunt, James McCord, Bernard Barker, and the Cubans had all either been full-time CIA employees or operatives that worked on behalf of the CIA. And as you might surmise, the allegation is you never really leave the employ of the CIA. And the point Hogan is making is that there's something going on here that doesn't meet the eye, that the CIA was operational on domestic issues. And then he goes on to point out the incredible ineptitude of the break-in. Everything kept going wrong. The first time they went to break in, the keys didn't work. There were alarms that weren't supposed to be there. It hadn't been scoped out. The guy couldn't pick the lock. They sent him back down to Miami. They come back up. They tried to break in on the 27th. It didn't work. They broke in on the 28th. It didn't work. They finally had to remove a door to get into the DNC. They checked in by going to the 8th floor, which was where the Federal Reserve was. The Federal Reserve had been burglarized 2 or 3 weeks before, so it should have set off the guards to wonder. 5 people coming in suits at midnight saying they're going to go up to the Federal Reserve Board is somewhat upsetting. Then there are a number of unexplained absences by James McCord. James McCord is the wire man. He's the one who's putting the taps in. And he keeps disappearing during the course of the break-in. They can't account for his time. Now, we know if something happened on stage and I was suddenly assassinated, and then we interviewed everybody, the stories wouldn't be consistent. That people see different things, the timing. Did Sandy speak first? Did Ron speak first? So there are going to be inconsistencies, but what Jim Hogan develops is a startling number of inconsistencies and unexplained things. And then there's what's called the secreted key. One of the Cubans had in his pocket and tried to get rid of, right when they first got arrested, a key. It was taped to the back of a notebook in his pocket. The key goes to a desk, and the desk becomes very significant because the secretary who had that desk may or may not have been involved in a prostitution ring. And there's a lawsuit that covers this because she felt that that was an unfair allegation. But the secreted key is rather key to Watergate conspiracy buffs. Finally, the man who was hired to monitor the phone taps, Alfred Baldwin, swears he monitored the first tap on May 26th, which is before the taps were installed. You have troubles. So what does Jim Hogan say was going on? He says there was a CIA love nest up the street in Columbia Plaza, and the CIA was terrified of exposure because it would show they were operating domestically. They were using mind-altering drugs, experimenting on people, foreign diplomats, DNC visitors from out of town who were looking for a good time with these girls and who may feel that they were taken advantage of when they woke up the next day, but could hardly go to the police. So the theory is that in order to avoid exposure of CIA operations, they were willing to do anything, but they couldn't stop Gordon Liddy, the Republicans, from wanting to break into the DNC. They were just terrified when they got there what they would find and what it would lead to. So it was an effort to botch the break-in and to lead it in a different location. Now here on the next slide, we're going to go forward for a second, here up the street is where the Columbia Plaza apartment building was. And this will figure again, but one of the theories that Hogan propounds is the wiretap was really tapping that phone or a phone down here that was calling into that. We don't know. I'm not a specialist in the CIA. The CIA can't defend itself. It's a magnificent target for conspiracy buffs because it's secretive anyway. But what's interesting is lots of other people are upset with the CIA disclosures in Watergate. The Minority Report from the Irvin Committee says we just couldn't ever get answers from the CIA. The special prosecutor puts out a report in 1974 of how they conducted their investigation, how the White House did, how the Department of Justice did, and they single out the CIA as being singularly non-cooperative. So it is not odd that the CIA figures in this. Whether it goes as far as Hogan is an open question, but a continuing controversy. There's also a couple of other tidbits in the book. No conspiracy works without mysterious deaths. Lou Russell and John Leone were just ready to testify when they died under mysterious circumstances. CIA Director Richard Helms, when he left to become ambassador of Iran, destroyed all of the CIA mind control documents. So the destruction of those documents certainly cleaned up the file of what may or may not have been going on, but leaves conspiracy buffs with lots to play with. And finally, because Hogan's book was written in 1984, and he's speculating on who Deep Throat might have been, he says, if Deep Throat is a prominent person, I mean, it could have been a secretary, we don't know, but if it's a prominent person, a prime candidate might be Alexander Haig, who was Nixon's second chief of staff, who took Bob Haldeman's place when he left. We leave you with open questions because that's how conspiracies work. And we will go forward to the next conspiracy theory, which is here, which is silent coup, written predominantly by Len Kolodny in 1991. He has a follow-up book in 2009 entitled 40 Years' War, The Rise and Fall of the Neocons from Nixon to Obama. And what Len says, this is my summary of Len's book, you're encouraged to read the book, he says, no, it's not the CIA. It's not the CIA. It's the military. The military, particularly the conservatives in the military, are terrified of President Nixon's activities with this Harvard professor whom they're not used to. And they've gone and reinvigorated the National Security Council in the White House, and they're not talking to us, and they're not telling us what's going on. They're announcing troop withdrawals without our knowledge and consent. They've done an opening to the Soviet Union, our worst enemy since World War II, they called détente. And they're talking to the communists in China. Kissinger has captured Nixon's mind, and he's taking it in a direction that threatens the national security of the United States. So what did the military do? Well, what any military would do under the circumstances, they set up a spy ring. And it was done by the Navy, it's called the Radford-Wellender-Moore spy ring. Admiral Moore was Chief of Naval Operations and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, rather high up. Admiral Wellender ran the liaison office in the White House that liaised with the National Security Council and transferred information back and forth, prepared briefings. And Yeoman Radford was a low-level, it's almost unfair to call him a male secretary, but the military in those days had lots of low-level people doing low-level jobs. He ingratiated himself to the other secretaries and less significant people on the staff, and it is alleged over the course of a couple of years he photocopied 5,000 pages of sensitive documents. He rifled Kissinger's briefcase. He went on a trip with him, because he could carry the luggage. Rifled his briefcase, made photocopies. Same thing with Al Haig. A hugely embarrassing situation. And they were caught. The other thing that Len develops is Bob Woodward, the cub reporter from the Washington Post, who helped do all the stories, was really heavily involved in naval intelligence. That he was really a briefing officer for the Joint Chiefs and for the NSC, that it was not just a reporter out of nowhere, and that he may have had access to this spy ring. Now, some of this goes back to Hogan's book, but it's developed in a different direction in Chladni's, because he says Alexander Haig, who took over as Chief of Staff, and Fred Bizart, who took over as Watergate Defense Counsel, were involved in treachery and an effort to bring down President Nixon, not to defend him. And that they may have been recipients of some of this spy material. And that they, particularly General Haig, was opposed to all of these things that was going on because he was a career military officer and he was doing his best to thwart them while he was Henry's deputy on the NSC, but was in a much better position to thwart these initiatives when he was the president's chief of staff. And then Len cites the inept Watergate defense. There were lots of decisions that in retrospect may or may not have been the brightest way to defend the president, particularly allowing exposure of the White House taping system. He makes a huge thing out of the fact the White House knew that Alexander Butterfield was going to testify as to the existence of the system, and these gentlemen allowed that testimony to go forward, and they could have ordered him not to testify. They could have stopped that, taken a different path. Not that it would have kept it secret forever, but they didn't have to allow this kind of exposure. So that's the neocon theory. But in the middle of Len Chladni's book, there's a third of the book that's devoted to John Dean. John Dean rarely appears in the earlier book, but he dominates the second book. And that segment, that middle segment, is entitled Golden Boy. And the theory is that was his nickname when he was on the White House staff. And it paints the most bizarre theory of John Dean. John Dean is an interesting person to examine, but Len really went into it in detail. And it's really two aspects. One aspect is that John Dean's fiancée at the time, Maureen Biner, was somehow involved in this prostitution ring. And John was worried that that would be exposed. So that was the reason for the break-in. Len concludes John Dean ordered the break-in with the intent to preserve Maureen Biner's, he later married her, so it's Maureen Dean, Maureen Biner's reputation. And the secreted key is to the desk of Maxie Wells, where her picture, her name, or contact information may or may not have been. But they didn't get there. But the nominal purpose was to tap Laurie O'Brien's phone. The real purpose was to look and retrieve possibly embarrassing information in the desk. Now, I used to say that there were no women in Watergate, you know, as all these criminals and cover-ups, and you go from that to the first two books, which key off of sex and scandal. And you really don't know who to believe. The other thing that Len Chladni did, he takes John Dean's testimony, and day by day, item by item, he says, this can't be true. When he told President Nixon, here's what I think we should do, and John Mitchell agrees, he hadn't talked to John Mitchell. When the decision was made to raise humanitarian funds for the Watergate burglars, it's laid at the feet of John Mitchell, and yet Chladni develops the fact that John Mitchell said, that's the last thing we're going to do. We're not going to become involved in that. And just every single item he undermines. Now, you come out that strong, particularly attacking a man's wife, as they say, litigation follows. And there was 7 years of litigation from John Dean to Len Chladni and St. Martin's Press, which published the book. It ended with a settlement that's sealed, remains sealed today. So we don't really know what happened, but nothing was ever retracted. The book has never been pulled. I noticed when I came to the bookstore, you could buy the book there in the bookstore today and have a review of their point of view. We leave you with open questions. I wasn't going to research those aspects. I'm a domestic affairs guy. Third conspiracy, and we're getting out on the edge here. The Rockefeller conspiracy is really the Trilateral Commission. You may have heard of that on the Council on Foreign Relations. We're going to give up U.S. sovereignty to one-worlders, and the Rockefellers are going to control the currency. That's the conspiracy theory that exists anyway, and it keys mainly off David Rockefeller. The application to Watergate picks up his brother Nelson Rockefeller, who was governor of New York and really wanted to be president. And it says his price for support of Nixon in '68 was that Kissinger had to be appointed to the National Security Council, so that Rockefeller really controlled Kissinger. And that the Plumbers break-in and the Watergate break-ins were engineered not by Nixon people, but by New Yorkers. David Young, co-plumber, was a Rockefeller protege, and Gordon Liddy was from Dutchess County, New York. So they really weren't Nixon people. These were Rockefeller people trying to create a vacancy in the presidency. And then to show you how far this goes, you remember President Nixon resigned, Jerry Ford became president, Nelson Rockefeller became vice president, unelected. Quote, he purchased his selection as vice president. But then President Ford had 2 assassination attempts. So this theory, and there's no book about this theory, but the theory exists, that President Ford had to substitute Bob Dole as his vice presidential candidate to avoid any additional assassinations. Because if in fact Ford had been assassinated, Rockefeller would have assumed the presidency without ever having been elected to anything. Now, dismiss the thing out of hand if you want, but one of the intriguing things, once you're informed of this conspiracy, you go back to Hogan's book, and it contains references to both Yeoman Radford and to James McCord, and both said, while I was happy to do what I was instructed to do, the real reason I did it was out of fear that the Rockefellers were taking over international finance. And it's truly bizarre. But you think, my heavenly days, there may have been people who were motivated by this. Then we get to the last conspiracy theory I call the Camelot conspiracy, and it consists of 3 publications. One's called Without Honor, The Impeachment of Richard Nixon and the Crimes of Camelot, 1995. My book, published in 2008, and the Chris Matthews article that I alluded to earlier. And it makes 4 quick points. That Kennedy confidants, Senator Ted Kennedy confidants, seemed to be behind everything, behind the exploitation of the scandal. A Kennedy confidant is retained as the Irvin Committee's chief investigator. Carmine Bellino had been working for the Kennedys for 30 years. A Kennedy confidant is retained as John Dean's defense counsel. Charles Schaffer had worked in Robert Kennedy's Department of Justice, was a part of a special unit personally hired by Robert Kennedy, and was Robert Kennedy's insertion into the Warren Commission staff. Robert Kennedy was worried organized crime had bumped off his brother. And he sent Charles Schaffer down, undisclosed to anybody else, for the sole purpose, joining the staff, not as a lawyer, but just as a staffer, to report back to Robert Kennedy on whether any information was developed about organized crime being involved in the Kennedy assassination. You couldn't find a lawyer closer to Kennedy interests than John Dean's. A Kennedy confidant was named special prosecutor. Archibald Cox was the Triple Crown winner of the Kennedy political dynasty. He had been speechwriter and issues coordinator for the 1960 presidential campaign. He was Solicitor General, the second highest ranking official in the Department of Justice, when Bobby Kennedy was Attorney General. And he worked very closely with Senator Edward Kennedy in his active opposition to President Nixon's nominees for Supreme Court. So he was actively involved with the Kennedys almost throughout. And he ends up being special prosecutor. And then, according to Jerry Ziefman, who was majority counsel of the House Judiciary Committees, not an insignificant person, a Kennedy confidant controlled the impeachment process. Burke Marshall, unknown to you, but had been head of the Civil Rights Division when John Doerr, who was running the staff, was deputy. And according to Ziefman, Burke Marshall was Ted Kennedy's choice to become Attorney General. He was orchestrating the impeachment hearings to slow them down. They didn't want to impeach and get rid of Richard Nixon. They wanted him to hang on to make the 1976 election easier for Senator Kennedy. Now, that's the Camelot conspiracy, but since I made up the slides and I'm the speaker, we get 2 more slides on this particular conspiracy, because you can buy that book in the bookstore too. I maintain the special prosecution force, the special prosecutor, was hugely political and did a whole series of improper things. But the one thing that jumps out, and it's a little hard to see the red from the black on the screen, 7 of the 8 senior members of the prosecution staff had all worked together in Robert Kennedy's Department of Justice. This was a team, top-flight lawyers, a team that was the creme de la creme of the opposition. Now, when Nixon said on his Watergate speech, you can appoint, if you choose, to Elliot Richardson, his nominee to be Attorney General, you can appoint a special supervising prosecutor. He was alluding to the Teapot Dome scandal when a lawyer was picked to make the tough decisions on who was going to be indicted and not indicted. What President Nixon did not envision, which is what happened, a staff of 100 people, 60 of whom ended up being lawyers over the course of its life, 4-year life, there were 60 lawyers who came through with nothing better to do than investigate the Nixon presidency. Now, you may work for a company. Your company you may think is law-abiding. I can tell you it could not withstand that kind of assault from your principal competitors. You just couldn't do it. So what I maintain in my book is this highly partisan special prosecution staff operating totally without restraint. The condition was total and absolute independence of the Department of Justice. They reported, if to anyone at all, to Senator Kennedy on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And what I maintain they did was they postponed the indictments of Dean and Magruder, John Dean and Jeb Magruder, which the career prosecutors had promised would come within about 2 months. They postponed them for 10 months. They didn't need to investigate Watergate because that case had been broken. The career prosecutors had broken the cover-up. They were ready to indict. But they were replaced by this political group, and they launched brand new investigations designed to destroy the Nixon presidency, to investigate every aspect of the presidency, to cripple Republican fundraising. They sent the FBI or the IRS to interview major Republican contributors and to investigate 1976 opponents. Amazingly, there's literature in the files that I uncovered from Freedom of Information Act requests where the lawyers and the special prosecution staff investigated Jerry Ford when he was named vice president. When he became president and he named Nelson Rockefeller, they launched an investigation immediately of Nelson Rockefeller. When Rockefeller was replaced as the Jerry Ford's candidate by Bob Dole, sure enough, they launched an immediate investigation of Bob Dole. And finally, there are indications in the files. There's not a file, but there's an allusion to the existence of a file that they investigated Governor Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California, because he was expected to be, and he indeed was, a presidential candidate in 1976. Now, these people had nothing to do with Watergate. But the difficulty is when you have absolute power, you have political corruption. And this group felt, why not? We'll go ask anybody. We'll go see what kind of derogatory information we can develop. So those are conventional wisdom and the four conspiracies. What we're going to do now, because you've been such a good audience, we're actually going to allow questions, and I think they're being submitted in writing. And Sandy, are you in a position to come read a question or two? Yes? No? Sandy's not here. We'll pick up the questions. I will take them. Thank you. Thank you. Any more? One more? The first question has to do with Hillary Clinton. I don't know if you're aware, but Hillary was a member of the House Judiciary Impeachment Inquiry staff. She was a recent graduate of Yale Law School, Hillary Rodham at the time. And in Jerry Ziefman's book, Without Honor, which dwells on those, the question was, what is her role? And Ziefman says she was one of 5 or 6 young lawyers under the direction and control of Burke Marshall, who was guiding and slowing down the impeachment. Now, we don't know for sure because the impeachment inquiry files have been sealed for 50 years, so we really can't find out. It's intriguing, it's salacious, but it's not known. Sandy, maybe you have some other questions from the internet.
I do, sir. On the White House tapes, you said you had transcribed the White House tapes. Wasn't that really done by President Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods?
Ah, okay. Yes, it was. Rose did the heavy lifting. Rose had to find the tapes on 6-hour reels, find the proper conversation, and do the first draft, which was recognize who was speaking, try to decipher the exchange in the conversations and when the conversation ended. And that was good enough for the initial review of the tapes. But when we went to turn the tapes over to the court and then to the special prosecutor, Fred Bizart's feeling was that we had to know precisely what was on those tapes. And where we had said that the tapes are very bad quality, so there's lots of unintelligibles, we needed to spend a lot more time seeing if we could decipher the unintelligibles. So what I spent hundreds of hours doing was polishing Rosewood's transcripts and trying to get those last few words so we would really know what the tape said. It's an interesting exercise because listening to the tapes is far different from reading a transcript. It's almost the difference between learning a language as growing up as a native and learning it in college. You can't pick up the subtleties or the innuendo unless you're really concentrating on the wording. And you can't pick up the intonation. And I would tell you, based on review of hundreds of tapes, hundreds of hours, that they're not conspirators. They're not sitting there saying, you know, what do you think about this? How do you think that's going to play? They really don't know what's going on. There's no conduct there that would suggest that this was a group that knew. And it's an intriguing, if painful, exercise to spend that much time listening. I have disagreements with lots of the transcripts, and I have disagreements with the meaning and import of all of the major conversations. The smoking gun, the Stonewall quote, the cancer on the presidency speech. I mean, it's almost like I come from a different place because I've studied those things so intently. Next, Sandy.
This is on the Irwin Committee. Most Americans remember Watergate from watching the Irwin Committee hearings, yet you don't talk much about their role.
Well, we only have 2 hours to cover a lifetime of review. I have a chapter in my book on the Irwin Committee. It is how most Americans remember Watergate. It is political theater at its finest. The president basically had no defenders on the committee. Lowell Weicker joined the committee for the express purpose of sinking President Nixon. Senator Baker made the political decision that it was in his interest not to fight the majority in public. He fought in private, but he would lose on every vote. So in public, he would participate in what was going on. 2 key votes that set up the Irwin Committee. One was a vote that they would not review House or Senate elections in 1972, so senators and congressmen and all the shenanigans in their elections weren't subject to disclosure. The second political vote, party line vote, was they would not investigate any other presidential election except 1972. Now, there's substantial reason to believe the other side was wiretapping in 1968, 1964, and 1960, but those were off the table. So you had, from the outset, a political witch hunt. What's so intriguing is when the White House gathered to figure out how to respond, how to combat, that was considered to be another overt act in the continuing cover-up because they were trying to resist the inquiry of the Irwin Committee. I have one in between, if I could. Someone has asked, how reliable is the author of Silent Coup? He is extraordinarily thorough. He, too, has spent his entire life dwelling on Watergate. I didn't do an independent investigation of what he has to say. I don't necessarily agree. I disagree that General Haig and Fred Bizart were there trying to bring the presidency down. But he does identify and isolate very, very disturbing facts about the military. I mean, it's very true there was a spy ring, and about John Dean. So you don't have to buy, you could buy 80% of what Len Kolodny writes, and you'd be very troubled about Watergate. Now, remember what Hogan says. The titles mean something. Hogan says there was a different agenda, which was the CIA's protecting itself. Len says, no, it was far worse than that. There was a takeover. The military caused a change in the presidency. I don't go that far, but it doesn't make me right and Len wrong. There's lots in Len's books that I buy into 100%.
Now, this question has to do with President Nixon himself. You really haven't talked much about the role of President Nixon. Wasn't he involved in the cover-up?
Yes. President Nixon was involved in political maneuvering to save his presidency. There's no question about that. He has every right to do that, every right to protect himself politically. If you look at the interviews with David Frost, and I don't mean the movie, which is a substantial fantasy, but the actual televised Frost interviews, and they're for sale in the bookstore, Nixon is making the point that he had no criminal intent. He doesn't use the word scienter, but that's evil intent. That what he was doing was trying to protect his administration. And that was recharacterized. And he was acting through his senior people, too. And that was recharacterized as continuing the cover-up. I mean, he had people doing the investigation. let me put it this way. If Richard Nixon were really running the cover-up, you would not have these obscure, ambiguous phrases in the tapes that people are trying to make into something that they aren't. It would be chapter and verse because the cover-up was so extensive. There are, I mean, you know, something like Shakespeare, you can go back through and pick on something, but it's not the same degree of involvement that America has been led to believe. So I listened to all these tapes. I've worried about this for a long time. I don't think he knew what was going on. His lawyer, John Dean, was dirty, was involved, intimately involved in the cover-up. At what point does a CEO or a family decide their lawyer is corrupt and has led them astray? By the time you figure it out, you've been involved. And if the lawyer suddenly claims, oh, we were all in it together, they knew what I was doing, how do you defend yourself? And that's the dilemma of those senior people as well as President Nixon. One more?
One more. This question has to do with Deep Throat. How does the exposure of FBI Director Mark Felt as Deep Throat affect these conspiracy theories?
Well, I will tell you one thing. The naming of Mark Felt, Deputy Director of the FBI, as Deep Throat ruined 30 years of cocktail conversation in Washington. And the speculation as to, you know, whether it was John Rose or Ken Kachigian or Diane Sawyer or Alexander Haig, who sold out the president? And then it turns out that the claim of a senile old man that he was Deep Throat is hurriedly confirmed by Bob Woodward as, yes, that's what it was. I really had this source in the FBI. That hasn't stopped the speculation, let me assure you. All the effort that went on before of you know, how tall was he, did he have flower pots, you know, what was going on, has switched to who was the source of Deep Throat. Or, more likely, wasn't Deep Throat really a composite? And didn't Woodward have other sources? Now, I've believed, ever since I left the White House staff, that Mark Felt was a source for Bob Woodward. Fred Bizarre believed that because stuff was leaking that was part of the investigation. And I believe, from having been on the staff for 5 years, the White House did not know what was going on, so it would be very hard to orchestrate the continuing cover-up after John Dean left because you didn't know what had been done. Oh, I do think one thing, though, and maybe there's a book in this. The one institution that hasn't figured in the conspiracy work is the FBI. And you can picture how the book would go. J. Edgar Hoover stayed too long. The FBI was engaged in nefarious acts that they shouldn't have been engaged in, both of which are true. The death of Hoover and the appointment of an outsider, Pat Gray, to run the FBI, threatened the exposure of all these nefarious acts within the FBI, and therefore its goal, the career goal of the people in the FBI, was to protect themselves, even if that meant the Nixon administration was brought down. So it wouldn't surprise me if sometime in the future we don't see that. The military makes a great object of a conspiracy. The CIA does, but so would the FBI. With that, what we're going to do, if you'll forgive me, we're going to stop the questions, and I'm going to go on to the second segment, which is the focus on John Dean. And you can see it's slightly out of focus because we're so good with these slides. We're going to spend some time on the one individual whom I think is the key to really understanding Watergate. There have been lots of books written. These aren't the only books. There are lots of books that have been written on Watergate by insiders. But John Dean's role, for the most part, plays a major segment in all of those books. And it doesn't play a major segment in his own book. You don't really learn much about John Dean or what I discovered, what I caused the National Archives to disclose about John Dean from his own book. So you're fighting, you're constantly fighting for information about John Dean. Here's a wonderful comment in a recent book by Conrad Black. This is an 1,100-page biography of Richard Nixon. I commend it to you. I must say, I found it mesmerizing. It goes through his whole life. But on page 846, he focuses on the beginning of Watergate, and he says, Gordon Liddy, an idiosyncratic figure, but in his own way a man of integrity, vehemently insisted that Watergate was Dean's idea. The truth of the matter will probably never be known. Dean is the most slippery of all the main players. And he's captured the problem of dealing with John Dean in Watergate. In spite of 37 years and all these investigations, we really don't know. There's another quote from the middle book here, which is really a book about John Mitchell called The Strong Man. Came out in 2008, and it's by James Rosen, who's a commentator on Fox News. And he says, the admitted ringleader in this multifarious undertaking, and he's talking about the cover-up, was John Dean, the ambitious young White House counsel who scrambled to find ways to raise the hush money that kept the cover-up together, kept close tabs on the FBI investigation and civil litigation that threatened to unravel it, and coached Magruder in his perjury. And that's kind of a capsulization of what John Dean was doing during the cover-up. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about concerns about John Dean. And we're going to go through the conventional wisdom, talk about his legal career, talk about how his story changed when there was a transition from the career federal prosecutors to the special prosecutor. The lead career prosecutor wrote a memo on the status of their investigation. And what he says in that memo is John Dean's testimony, his story of what happened, escalated. I think he says, in other words, John Dean's story escalates over time. And that thought that his story changed is very troublesome. We'll get into that in some detail, and then we'll talk about what I characterize as John Dean's disappearing prison sentence. So let's go to conventional wisdom. Here you have a guy who most people think was a young, inexperienced lawyer caught up in something beyond his control, fell in with the wrong people, and made a clean breast of it by going to the government and confessing. But look what the prosecutors say about John Dean, and I'm going to read it to you, so I want to introduce it for a second. This is a book in 1977 by two, Richard Benvenisti and George Frampton, who were on the Watergate task force. These are the prosecutors, and they're talking about, they call it Stonewall, the real story of the Watergate prosecution. They're talking about the cover-up trial and how it worked. And they're talking about Archibald Cox, who was the first special prosecutor, this Kennedy Democrat. I read, Archie Cox was particularly firm in his personal determination that Dean be prosecuted no matter what. Dean became an idée fixe, that's French for obsession, for Cox. With all the uncertainties of Watergate that swirled around him, Cox saw Dean's guilt as the one enduring constant. During a particularly difficult period, Archie remarked to us, if everything else goes down the drain, the one thing I can cling to is Dean's venality. Now, if that's the first special prosecutor, and that's his view of John Dean, the central figure, why did he believe that, and what happened? And that's what we're going to spend the rest of the segment on. Okay. Dean's central role in Watergate. Dean is there at the beginning and at the end. First, he triggered events that led to the Watergate break-in. Dean is tasked by Bob Haldeman to assemble, in Dean's words, a perfectly legitimate campaign intelligence plan. He recruits Gordon Liddy. He recommends Gordon Liddy to John Mitchell and Jeb Magruder. He discusses with Gordon Liddy what the White House wants in the way of campaign intelligence. He promises Gordon at least $500,000, maybe more, to do his plan. So John Dean is present at the creation. He is the instigator of Gordon Liddy putting the plan together. But then, and because of that he was at risk, John Dean hides his own risk of prosecution from his White House superiors, from President Nixon, Bob Haldeman, and John Ehrlichman. John Dean was present at 2 critical meetings in the Attorney General's office when Gordon Liddy presented his plan, and his plan was over the top. It's been summarized as a proposal for mugging, bugging, kidnapping, and prostitution. Okay? First meeting is January 28th, 1972. It's rejected. They think maybe it costs too much. It costs $1 million. He comes back on February 4th. Now, this is in the office of the Attorney General of the United States. There are only 4 people in the meeting: John Mitchell, Jeb Magruder, Gordon Liddy, and John Dean. It almost becomes comical when you really get down into the weeds about why they were there. Gordon Liddy shows up at CREEP saying, I've been promised $1 million for an intelligence plan. And Jeb Magruder, who's acting chief of staff, says, I don't have the authority to commit $1 million. The only man that does that is John Mitchell. He's still over there as Attorney General. We got to go over there and get his permission for the $1 million. And you could say, why did you do this? But they go over, and it's rejected. They go back with a $500,000 plan on February 4th. Plan's not approved. But later there's this break-in. Well, if you were John Dean, you were in real trouble. You hired him. You discussed the plans with him. You were present at these 2 plans. So John Dean is worried from the moment the burglars are arrested that he's at risk. Now, I tell you on faith, if he had told his superiors this, he would have been fired forthwith. He would have been removed. He was a threat because there wasn't anybody that they were worried about on the White House staff. And John Dean himself had told them that no one on the White House staff knew of the break-in in advance. So they built their entire defense over the idea that the problem was at CREEP. If we could just keep it over at CREEP, it may be bad, but it's not going to infect the White House itself. But the guy they picked to run it was dirty. And he orchestrated the cover-up as though he were an employee of CREEP. He acted, by his own admission, as chief desk officer throughout the cover-up. He was the chief operating officer of the cover-up. He knew what was going on, and in general, he suborned perjury. That's encouraging the perjury of someone else, of Jeb Magruder, going before the grand jury. He improperly leaked government information on the investigation to the defense counsel. He destroyed evidence. There's really critical evidence from Howard Hunt that Howard said would enable him to justify what he was doing, that Dean admitted later that he had destroyed. And he took money. There was lots of money floating around. Dean borrowed about $4,000 without asking anybody, happened to be in his own safe, to pay for his honeymoon. And then he didn't go on the honeymoon. He didn't last. But he never put the money back. He put a note in his own safe saying, by the way, I owe you some money. And so he's heavily involved in the cover-up, and he's at real risk. Then, when the cover-up collapsed, and the cover-up should have collapsed, don't misunderstand. The cover-up should have collapsed. It should never have occurred. John Dean switched sides and his story. He was the first official in to see the prosecutors to exchange testimony for immunity. And in the course of his time in talking with the prosecutors, his story changes. And because of that, he served the least time of any central figure, because he was the only roadway to get to Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and the president, so they needed him, and they protected him, because he was the way to get to the big fish. We're going to spend a lot of time on these last 2 items. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about Dean's legal career. It's 5 different organizations. It spans 8 years. It ends badly. He's terminated. He pleads to a felony. He's disbarred at the end of his legal career. But there was a meteoric rise from graduating from Georgetown Law School in 1965, working for a private law firm for 6 months, then the House Judiciary Committee, then the Brown Commission on the Reform of Federal Criminal Laws, then the Department of Justice, and then counsel to the president. I mean, absolutely meteoric rise, particularly for someone who was not involved in any operational way in Nixon's campaigns. I mean, the man almost comes out of nowhere, and there's lots of speculation about that, how that occurred, but it kind of centers on the thought that the effort was to downgrade the office of counsel. He told his probation officer in the pre-sentence report that there were really only two functions that he performed when he first got there: the reaction to clemency petitions from the Department of Justice, please pardon this guy, and the review of FBI investigations to clear people, presidential appointees, for appointments to the federal government. That's all the counsel's office was doing after John Ehrlichman left. John took all the fun, all the heavy involvement, and all the staff with him to be assistant to the president for domestic affairs. The other thing that's odd about this is John Dean's first job, his only job in private practice, lasted only 6 months. And he was fired. He was fired for unethical conduct. And we show you here, again, freed from at my instance, from documents. You can't read this, but I can. This is a civil service questionnaire that was submitted to the lead partner of the law firm. And it says, has the individual ever been discharged under adverse circumstances? The answer is yes. And the question is why? And the answer is unethical conduct. Did the employee know that that was why he was discharged? Yes. And here it says, see answer to 5B. While employed by this firm, applicant undertook work, unbeknownst to us at the time, in direct conflict with the interests of the firm and a client thereof. Now, what I understand happened, and I didn't do investigation, this is an understanding on my part, this is an FCC firm, a small boutique firm. It does broadcast license applications before the Federal Communications Commission. And in those days, if you got a broadcast license, you got lots of money because it's a monopoly of one aspect of the airwaves. They were doing a license application for a client in St. Louis. John, right out of law school, learned how to do it, concluded it could be very lucrative, and on his own participated with a group of people to file a competing application in St. Louis that also included his mother-in-law. The firm found out, you can see how the firm would take it badly, and he was fired. This form is not put in when he was fired. Being fired was bad enough. He went to House Judiciary. But this form is put in September of 1967, a year and a half later, because this form is being circulated in connection with his recent employment by the Brown Commission. They're doing a review of him, and of course, something like this would render you unemployable. So pressure was brought on the lead partner to please back off a little bit because you've ruined the guy. You not just fired him, but you've ruined the guy. So there is a second letter. And the second letter goes in about a month and a half later. And the operational language down here is, upon further consideration, my description may have overstated. A more apt characterization of Mr. Dean's departure would be to describe it as having resulted from a basic disagreement over law firm policies regarding the nature and scope of an associate's activities. So he's backing it off, I would suggest out of grace, but you can read the letter as well as I. But he does one very interesting thing. He does not withdraw his previous filing. He says, please include this letter with what I had submitted before. So John Dean's career began badly, had a meteoric rise, and ended badly. We go to the next segment, which is called Getting the Story Straight. This is complicated. It's going to be on the exam. You want to pay very close attention to this part. And it's about 5 slides, and I apologize, but I think this is hugely newsworthy. It's public for the first time today because of research I did, because of Freedom of Information Act requests that I made. John Dean's communications with career federal prosecutors spanned 12 meetings over the month of April. The first meeting is April 2nd, 1973. The cover-up has collapsed. His lawyer goes in to bargain for immunity. We can give you Mitchell. We can give you Magruder. It ends May 3rd, 1973. It's the last meeting. And pretty much, if it's in Schaffer's office, Schaffer is Dean's lawyer, Dean is there, it's late at night, the meetings go on for 4 or 5 hours. And there's 2 or 3 of the career federal prosecutors taking notes on their interviews of John Dean. And what we're going to see is over the course, and this is the first and the last meeting, because after this, he refuses to go in front of the grand jury. He's supposed to go in front of the grand jury on May 5th without immunity. They insisted no immunity. And he says, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to make my deal with the Irvin Committee. So there's just 12 meetings or phone calls, and there are notes taken by the 2 or 3 career prosecutors who were there. The notes, of course, are what never became public and I got disclosed. And the notes are dynamite. And I'm quoting from I'm sorry, I misstated. The prosecutors took the notes, the career prosecutors. Then they're relieved because the special prosecutors come on the scene and is picking up where they left off. And these interviews occurred in September and October of 1973, and they're interviewing the career prosecutors about their meetings with John Dean. So you've got the judgment of 6 months on top, and they're saying, well, you know, what happened at the first meeting, what happened in the second meeting? And somebody's in the meeting, a member of the Watergate Task Force in the Special Prosecution, who's taking notes as to what's said. They're interviewing Doug Campbell and Seymour Glanzer, 2 of the 3 career federal prosecutors. And the first entry that's relevant to us is April 6th, the meeting of April 6th with John Dean. And this is John Dean's lawyer. Nothing about Ehrlichman, Haldeman, or the president. Schaffer talked only of Mitchell and Magruder. As I alluded to at the beginning, I can deliver Mitchell, I can deliver Magruder. The 8th, 2 days later, no info from Dean, Ehrlichman, and Haldeman. Now, this is a meeting in Schaffer's office with Dean, but Dean has not talked about Ehrlichman or Haldeman either. The 9th, the next day, another meeting in Schaffer's office. Dean didn't mention the cover-up until later. So you begin to get the drift. I'm going to help you to get the drift. He comes in to bargain for immunity. Lawyer says, I'd like to help you, but you got to help him. Give him immunity. He would really tell you everything, but you got to give him immunity. But he's not talking about Ehrlichman or Haldeman or President Nixon. And then it turns out he's not talking about a cover-up. He's talking about crimes committed by other people, but he's not coming in saying, and we obstructed justice. That doesn't come up. Here on the 9th continued, and that's the phrase in the notes, Dean never said the money was for Hunt's silence. He's describing the payments, which we all call hush money. He's describing the payments, but he's not saying it was buying silence. Now, you need to know another fact. $400,000 changed hands. It was very significant, and it was secretly left in mailboxes and everything else for the defendants, the burglary defendants. But it was conceded at trial, the cover-up trial, that every payment was in response to a submission for reimbursement of legal expenses or humanitarian aid. And the defense said, we were merely taking care of our own. We were not buying their silence. And of course, John Dean said, well, that's what you say now, but we were buying their silence. That's why else would you do it? Now, you also need to know, in every major political scandal, the individual is left abandoned. And in every scandal I know of, their legal fees are covered. You can't let them stay out there bare. Who knows what they might say? So that's usually taken care of. It's not characterized later as an obstruction of justice. It's just taken care of. Happens in the corporate world. Same thing. If you've got someone who's accused, you enable them to mount their own defense. But what is odd here is by April 9th, this is six meetings, he's not saying the money was for silence. But the real killer's here at the bottom. I hope you didn't read ahead, because this is significant. We're into May. This is the last meeting. It's 2 days, but it's summarized in the notes as one. Situation's in a state of flux because the Irvin Committee and the new prosecutor are coming. Dean becomes antagonistic to E and H, that's Ehrlichman and Haldeman. Whereas before, he had given the impression that Haldeman was clean and was restrained as to Ehrlichman's involvement. Now, if your lead witness in a trial is dirty, criminal himself, and for a full month has met with prosecutors and not said boo about his superiors, you could conclude his story was evolving, Earl Silbert's word was escalating. That information, under law and Supreme Court decision, must be disclosed to the defense because it's possibly exculpatory. You know, the Department of Justice isn't in the business of just winning cases. They're in the business of prosecuting under rule of law. And there's a Jenks Act and a Brady decision that says exculpatory information must be disclosed. This is exculpatory information. This could be used to impeach John Dean on the stand as a witness. Were you lying then or are you lying now? How come a full month passed? But it was never disclosed. Okay? It gets a little better. 2 more slides on this. These are the handwritten notes. They were then typed up. Now watch what happens when it's typed up. This is paragraph 12, and this is a quote from the typed version. By the end of April, he'd become much more antagonistic toward Haldeman and Ehrlichman in his discussions with the prosecutors, issuing his scapegoat. He said, I won't be the scapegoat in public. Before that, the impression he gave of Haldeman was of a great devoted public servant, clean and hardworking. He had been restrained in his praise of Ehrlichman. Now, that's turning this inside out, okay? Go back just for a second, too. This is clearly labeled May 2nd and 3rd. But when you go forward, it's not. It's just, it's kind of loose. It's kind of toward the end of April. So you've lost the date. You've changed Haldeman from being clean to being clean cut, and Ehrlichman's involvement from being restrained to being restrained in his praise. This is the sort of thing that we call tampering with the evidence. This is the sort of thing that gets lawyers disbarred. This is a dramatic change in what was really said. This memo, too, was not turned over to the defense. I mean, even so, this is still not bad for Ehrlichman and Haldeman. Okay? And then later in this same memo, the same thing happens to President Nixon, paragraph 15, on May 3rd, at least we have the date. Dean began focusing on presidential involvement, and these are the special prosecutor's own words, thus dramatically changing his previous stance. That would have made a difference in the trial. That would have made a huge difference. You could have used that to impeach the primary witness, but this was kept hidden. So I leave you on this segment with this thought. Dean's story evolved, escalated, changed from, I can tell you who did the break-in and why, to we were all in it together. He had his story straight in front of the Irvin Committee. But this should have been disclosed at trial. You can raise the question. It just happened in the Ted Stevens trial. Same thing. Ted Stevens' trial was Senator Stevens cheating on reimbursement. The lead witness changed his testimony, and that was kept hidden. The FBI agent told the judge, case was thrown out. There's strong reaction to this sort of thing. We go back to the last segment, Dean's disappearing prison sentence. This is the other aspect of the exam. 5 or 6 slides, and we're done. We're going to start with a timeline and show you what happened with John Dean. First, on October 19th, he pled guilty to a single felony. That's October 1973. And sentence was postponed until the conclusion of the cover-up trial. That's the standard procedure with government witnesses. You plead guilty to a count. Your sentence is postponed until after the trial at which your testimony is relevant. So that's perfectly standard practice. But then something happened in April of 1974. That's the trial of John Mitchell and Maurice Stans. He was chief financial officer for the committee to reelect. They were acquitted in what's called the Vesco trial in New York. And you don't really need to know that was an allegation that for a mere $200,000 of campaign donation, Robert Vesco's troubles with the SEC were supposed to disappear. They took it to a jury in New York, and the jury acquitted them, said, no, that's not what happened. John Dean was the principal witness, and in interviewing the jury on the way out, the jurors said he wasn't credible. Dean wasn't credible. So great worry began in Washington about Dean's credibility, perhaps with good reason. What happened next is best described by Judge John Sirica, the presiding judge, at both the Watergate break-in trial and the cover-up trial. And I read, when Dean was on the stand in the New York case, the defense attorneys had suggested from time to time he was testifying against Mitchell and Stans in order to get a lighter sentence from the court in Washington. That's from me. It was a legitimate way for those attorneys to try to discredit Dean, given the fact he hadn't yet been sentenced by me. But I didn't want the defense to use the same tactic in the cover-up case. Dean had already made his plea bargain with prosecutors. As long as he appeared to testify fully and truthfully, I knew what he said on the witness stand wasn't going to make any difference in the sentence I handed down. So to prevent the suggestion that he was testifying in the hope that I would reduce his sentence, I decided to give Dean that sentence well before the trial. This is a change in standard procedure. This is an effort to have you testify from jail. And indeed, what Judge Sirica did on August 2nd, 1974, he sentenced John to a prison term of 1 to 4 years. Now, he's only pled to a single felony. The most he can get is 5 years. And he's given 1 to 4. And his confinement begins on September 3rd, which is the opening day of the cover-up trial. So he can go say, I've been punished. I'm testifying from jail, and look what they did to me. These are the only people who haven't been punished. Let's see from Dean's own book how he describes the surprise of a 1 to 4 year sentence. I was absorbing Judge Sirica's words. He threw the book at me. The most he could have given me was 5 years, and he gave me 4. Why did he do that? I don't understand, Charlie Schaffer said over and over. This is my fault, John. I should never have allowed you to plead to Sirica. I'm sorry, I didn't know. I don't understand. Charlie was as shaken by the sentence as if it were his own. How can he do that, I asked plaintively. I figured I'd get something like Krogh. Bud Krogh was the head plumber. 6 to 18 months. Maybe a year at the most. He hit me harder than Magruder. Even Colson didn't get the sentence I got. It can't be. And then he describes the reaction of his wife, Maureen. How could he do that? Mo shrieked hysterically. She was sobbing, out of control. So you have this dramatic and unexpected sentencing of the principal accusatory witness to 1 to 4 years. What effect did it have? Well, he testified from October 16th to the 23rd at the trial. And how did that go? And we get that again from the book by the prosecutors. Moral balancing aside, the realpolitik of the situation was that Dean would not be an effective witness if he got a free ride. His credibility would be substantially diminished if the prosecutors completely forgave his own deep involvement. The evident effect of Dean's prison sentence later on the jurors at the Watergate cover-up trial confirmed our tactical judgment. As a man who was already serving a long jail term for doing what he testified he'd been instructed to do by Haldeman and Ehrlichman, Dean made a measurably greater impression than if he had never been charged or punished for his acts. So this tough sentence really worked. It really increased his credibility and persuaded the jury. So we know John Dean was sentenced to prison. How did he spend his time? 3 or 4 more slides. This is an official document pulled from the Special Prosecution Force, and it's from Jim Neal, the lead prosecutor for Watergate, to James Vorenberg, who was number 2 in the Special Prosecutor's office. Dean's scheduled to surrender to Lompoc, which is here near LA. It's the federal minimum security prison near Los Angeles. Please arrange with the Bureau of Prisons to have him retained at Fort Holabird until further notice. The reason is so I can work with him in preparation for his trial. It's important to know the retention of Dean at Fort Holabird is for the convenience of the government and not as a favor to John Dean. Fort Holabird is a witness holding facility, and at the time there were 21 people at the holding facility, and it's really designed as a safe house for mafia witnesses who are about to testify against the mafia, and it would be helpful if they lived. So it's confinement. There's no question about that. It's on a military base to protect you, but it's not prison in any normal sense of the term, not how we understand prison, not Lompoc. Well, if that's how he spent his nights, how did John Dean spend his days? What a strange question. But we go back to John Dean's own book. And this is wonderful. You have to get with it, but this is wonderful. This is a quote. John, I really don't think this is appropriate. Hank Ruth, Jaworski's replacement as special prosecutor, was frowning. If the press got hold of this, they'll go crazy. He threw down a John Dean office name plate down on my desk and waited for an answer. Well, Hank, I sputtered. I didn't know whether to take his remarks seriously. I didn't put it on the door. One of the secretaries did it as a joke. They think I'm almost one of the guys. I know, he said flatly, but we can't afford this kind of stuff. I'm already catching a lot of flack about the office you've got. Okay, I understand. I knew there was some resentment that I had fared so well in the office shuffle at the Special Prosecutor's K Street headquarters. When the Watergate trial team had moved to the courthouse, I had been assigned Neal's old office. This is the head of the Watergate task force. On the 9th floor, a corner location with lots of windows. So John Dean, sentenced 1 to 4 years of prison, is spending his nights at Fort Holabird and his days in the Special Prosecutor's office, not with a trial team down at the courthouse, but on K Street in a corner office. What, we ask, was he doing during that time? Here's what he was doing, and this is an excerpt from Dean's financial statement given in connection with his sentencing. I signed a contract with a Bantam book publishing company to write 2 non-Watergate books about government. It's my hope to write whenever I'm not being called upon by the government to testify, and hopefully complete the first manuscript by March of next year. Oh, you're left with the idea that this principal accuser, heavily involved in Watergate, sentenced to 1 to 4 years, spending his night at Fort Holabird, his days at the Special Prosecutor's office, writing his book. Not the image conveyed to the American public, not the image conveyed to the jury. Then what happens? Well, the jury convicted. They convicted Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Mitchell on all counts. I mean, there's no question about that. Real jury, real conviction. But then the other shoe dropped. This is what's so troubling. On January 8th, 1 week later, Judge Sirica reduced Dean's sentence to time served, setting him free after 4 months of technical confinement. Let's go back to Sirica's book for a moment. Down here at the bottom, I knew as long as what he said on the stand was not going to make any difference in the sentence I handed down. So to prevent the suggestion he was testifying in the hope I would reduce his sentence, I decided to give Dean that sentence well before the trial. Now, when he threw the book at him, 1 to 4 years, there were other books that said, you know, this is really to improve his credibility. But nobody thought Judge Sirica would write in his own book with the implication that he did it to increase his credibility before the jury, and then when the jury convicted, set him free. That is astonishing. People less generous than I could say, that's a fraud on the jury. That's an intentional fraud on the jury. I wouldn't go that far. But you can see what we have here, and we're last slide. We have a situation where the principal accuser, the one who was involved throughout, one who changed his story, is hidden from the defense, and his prison sentence is trumped up and then taken away. And you ask yourself, did they get a fair trial? They may have done what they were accused of doing. The cover-up went on for so long, and there were so many meetings, they could have crossed the line. They were trying to protect themselves politically. Maybe they did. But even criminals, even Republicans, get a fair trial. And you could conclude from this, perhaps, they did not. So we end the enduring allure of Watergate. This is a botched quote from Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill said on the radio in 1939, it's a paraphrased quote. He said on the radio, Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, but perhaps there's a key. The key is an appeal to Russia's national interest. He was talking about getting Russia to come into World War II. But it's most appropriate for Watergate. Watergate is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. I think there's a key. I think the key is John Dean. The question is, which version do you believe? Now, what's so amazing, after 37 years, the Watergate scandal is a story for which the last chapters are still being written. I thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed your afternoon.
Thank you, Geoff Shepard. Those of us who spent years working and being around Richard Nixon really have become exhausted with hearing so much so many one-sided points of view about Watergate. So and about Richard Nixon's knowledge and role in it. So it's refreshing indeed to hear another point of view, particularly so factually based as Geoff Shepard presented, as only a Harvard lawyer could do. He will, that Harvard lawyer, now be available in our gift shop to sign copies of Inside the Real Watergate Conspiracy. And if you will join us in the gift shop, the books are available, as will be our speaker in just moments. Thank you for coming. Please watch our website, again, nixonfoundation.org, and hear more about exciting and interesting programs coming here. Thank you for coming.